everything depends on how you count. But let's start here. How many investigations does Donald Trump face right now? 17 into his links to Russia, according to a count from Wired magazine. And before we go any further, consider just how unusual this is tonight. My colleague, Rachel Maddow, put this situation quite well by noting it doesn't even matter anymore how old you are. You haven't seen anything like this.
I mean, I don't know who you know or how old they are, but nobody else has ever lived through a moment in the American presidency like this. We're the first.
We're the first, and most people haven't seen a sitting president publicly turn on the FBI in order to try to apparently save himself. That's exactly what former FBI Director James Comey just publicly alleged late today. He was coming out of his private testimony to Congress, but he spoke briefly to the public assembled there, some of the reporters, and he says Donald Trump's team is willing to literally burn down the FBI, and that too many members of Congress, the building where you see Comey standing there, have been basically way too silent the whole time.
Their only opportunity to challenge it would be to burn down the entire FBI. To my shock and horror, they've tried to do just that in the face of silence from people in this building.
Silence. Many Republicans in Congress may be silent, but these prosecutors, they're not. New details tonight on Russia's online misinformation effort, which continued after the election and is still under investigation. This is a report commissioned by the U.S. Senate, and talk about an international cover-up. It finds that these Russian efforts continue to go after Mueller directly, portraying his probe as, quote, nonsense, claiming that Mueller and Comey were corrupt. And their propaganda, these Russian efforts, echoed Donald Trump's rhetoric, saying the entire Russia investigation was a, quote, weird conspiracy pushed by liberal crybabies. Also new today, more fallout from Mike Flynn. Now, he'll be sentenced tomorrow. Today, though, two of his colleagues indicted in federal court for a conspiracy to violate U.S. lobbying laws, the case building on a Mueller pattern. Investigate, indict, flip, and then deploy other prosecutors to handle the things that may go beyond his actual mandate. Now, as this pressure builds, we're also seeing Rudy Giuliani back on offense, which in his case, you may have noticed, sometimes looks like, I don't know, inadvertent defense. It is a big deal that federal prosecutors say President Trump directed Michael Cohen's criminal payoff to silence women. But now Giuliani says Trump didn't direct it, but even if he did, it's not a crime.
Did Mr. Trump direct Michael Cohen to pay off these two women or not?
No, the truth is actually what Cohen testified to under oath before Congress and what he repeated numerous times on surreptitious tape recordings that he made, which is that the president didn't know about this until some time into it. But, Chris, even if it were true, it's not a crime.
That may be Giuliani's opinion. The problem is the prosecutors and Cohen have now agreed that it was a crime. Giuliani also appeared to get tripped up over how long Trump was seeking business in Russia back during 2016 in the campaign. Now, this is something the president has already been caught lying about.
Did Donald Trump know that Michael Cohen was pursuing the Trump Tower in Moscow into the summer of 2016?
According to the answer that he gave, it would have covered all the way up to November of 2016. He said he had conversations with him about it. The president didn't hide this. They know.
Earlier, they had said those conversations stopped in January 2016.
I mean, the date, until you actually sit down and answer the questions, and you go back and you look at the papers and you look at you're not going to know what happened. That's why lawyers, prepare for those answers.
Yes. Well, let's go look back at the papers. Because the papers submitted in court, verified by federal investigators, show Cohen working on the Trump Tower Moscow deal up through June 2016 and then dropping it around the time Russian meddling became public. Now, after Trump's past lies, Giuliani is clearly opening the door to somebody working on that Russia deal, maybe somebody other than Michael Cohen, all the way through November 2016, which, just think about it tonight, it sounds bad. Why would Trump's own lawyer put it out? Is this another Giuliani gaffe? Well, maybe not. On the one hand, you always have to keep in mind a classic legal principle, which is Giuliani gonna Giuliani, which means some gaffes. But on the other hand, if someone did keep working on trying to get money from Russia for Trump all the way through November, and if Bob Mueller already knows about it, then yeah, Trump's team may keep leaking out these apparently bad things one at a time to try to blunt the impact of Mueller's final report. Let's get into it. We have a great panel. Maya Wiley, former counsel to the mayor of New York City and a civil prosecutor in the SDNY, where Michael Cohen confessed. Mara Gay, an editorial board member of the New York Times, and defense attorney Caroline Polisi, who represents guilty Trump aide George Papadopoulos. So a lot of expertise here. We're going to get to you and your client. But Maya, first, what's Rudy doing?
Making mistakes. Because anywhere you slice it, it's a mistake. Either he just doesn't know what he's talking about, and or he is literally making clear that the information we have been receiving from the White House, from their talking points, are not accurate. So it doesn't really matter what he's doing. Either way, it's a problem for this administration. And when you count up all its problems, including every single entity that Donald Trump has created under investigation by some law enforcement somewhere, that's a problem.
Counselor, may I push you on that a little bit?
Yes, you may.
You're stipulating the view that it does not matter. An alternative interpretation, though, would be that if you have past lies in public, which are bad but legal, and people are going into the grand jury or Congress where lies become illegal, and you know that Mueller's uncovered some things, you may want to fix your public story to prevent criminal lying as opposed to legal lying.
It's hard to correct if you said something in the context of law enforcement that was untrue. It's hard to turn around later and correct it. So it's not that it's not a problem. It's that whatever scenario we're looking at from Rudy Giuliani, meaning he either just doesn't know what he's talking about, or there's actually been, which I believe, which is...
You're on theory number one, which is Rudy's going to Rudy.
No, I'm actually more on both these things can be true. Rudy can Rudy, and people can be telling lies. All of that can happen at the same time. I actually think that Rudy understands what he's trying to do and not doing it very well.
Well, Mara,
we have a long history of that.
Mara,
as
you know, Maya Wiley's legal analysis can contain multitudes. So there's layers on layers. I want to play for you the really messed up situation that America is in tonight. I don't know any other way to put it. And James Comey just came out and blasted it, which is you have public officials, I don't care what party, they're public officials, and they are out defending Mike Flynn after he confesses to a felony. And they write the laws. They wrote the laws that say you can't do this. Take a look at Comey today.
They're up here attacking the FBI's investigation of a guy who pled guilty to lying to the FBI. He should have been warned you shouldn't lie. He should have been told you can have a lawyer. Think of the state of affairs we've ended up in. That's nonsense.
So what James Comey is talking about is actually something that when you pull back is extremely dangerous. I think we're in a even more dangerous moment than we were or have been in for the past 2 years. And that's because we have so much information about so many crimes or potential crimes that have been committed by either the president or people close to him. And I think when you look at the 17 different investigations that are going on, there's plenty of evidence of wrongdoing here. The dangerous moment is that we don't know yet whether Congress actually will do its job and bring people not necessarily to justice in their case, but hold people accountable for this. And I also think that we have a responsibility in the media to make sure that we really take a hard look at the kind of spin that's coming out of the White House at this moment, because I think it's very clear from Donald Trump's tweets and from Rudy Giuliani's statements and, frankly, distraction, that they are willing to call up, down, and left, right, and they will go to any lengths.
Or a crime, not a crime.
Right, exactly. And so I think we really need to try and separate for Americans the best we can fact from fiction, because it really does become this steady drumbeat of Americans being deluged with so much information that they eventually shut off and can't decipher what the larger narrative is.
Which, not to keep going back to the theory, but that is door number two, which is that it's not just Rudying, but that they're just trying to put this out, trickle, trickle, trickle. Now, you have a client who did cooperate with the special counsel.
Not technically, right. He didn't technically get a 5K1 letter, but yes, he tried. He attempted.
You're going to come in here with the 5K1 letters. You have a client who did not resist the interrogations of the special counsel in the long run and was granted leniency.
That's right.
Okay. Now, you see how much time I had to... I'm just kidding with you. But
No, I just make the distinction because I think it's interesting when you look at the Michael Flynn, who is an actual cooperator.
Right,
He's
who's all the way
a
in.
kindler and gentle special counsel's office, as opposed to, say, a Michael Cohen, who was a cooperator but wasn't technically a cooperator in the terms of,
Right, and that it's you mentioned that. I'm actually going to speak with Cohen's former lawyer later tonight because the federal prosecutors in New York did make a big point of that, and they say that's why he should get more jail time. So I appreciate your expertise and your distinction on that. James Comey today, though, was breathing hot fire at Donald Trump for what he calls rat cooperation, which I don't think goes down to the technical degree we're talking about, because Donald Trump was mad at your client and Michael Cohen and others for this. Take a look at Comey saying why this is so bad.
It undermines the rule of law. This is the President of the United States calling a witness who has cooperated with his own Justice Department a rat. Say that again to yourself at home and remind yourself where we have ended up. There's a set of values that represent the glue of this country, and they are under attack by things just like that.
Given your experience practicing and litigating right in this case, in the Russia probe, and you look at Comey calling that out, is he hitting the right tone? Is Donald Trump wrong to attack people who cooperate with law enforcement?
Well, look, it's definitely utterly unprecedented. Like it or hate it, the fact is that we have a criminal justice system that is based upon the cooperating witness. When you enter this system, you're either exiting it behind bars or you're becoming, in my line of business, some people tend to call them rats, you call them cooperators, but that's the facts. That's how the system works.
Is it wrong for the president? Is it wrong for the president to call them rats?
I think it is. I think it does definitely undermine the democracy on which our country has been founded on. For sure.
And in your experience,
it's his Justice Department.
In your experience, without getting into the parts that are privileged, but in your experience, did the Mueller probe work honestly with these people to gather information, or did it, as Donald Trump alleges, somehow squeeze people into false information?
Look, I mean, again, I'm not going to get into any attorney-client privilege. I'm not
asking you to.
But, I think everybody comes at a different perspective. When I think Michael Flynn's attorneys pushed it too far when they said that, the FBI investigators had a duty to tell them that it was, in fact, a crime to lie to the FBI, which I think we can safely say that Michael Flynn knew that. There are a lot of investigative techniques in this country that people are not happy with. The FBI can lie to you. They can know the answer to a question that they're asking you, and that can still be a material lie.
Right, but I think what we're getting at is that's the system. We can have a broad discussion about that, but investigators, cops, FBI agents are going around the country playing hardball, and they play hardball with a lot of kids in the inner city. They play hardball with a lot of people who've done all sorts of things or haven't done all sorts of things. What you have here is a very selective outrage, and don't you think that interferes with the investigation?
I absolutely. I think that's the point. The point is to interfere with the investigation. I don't think anybody is making any statement otherwise.
I just think it's an extraordinary moment, and it's easy to lose how extraordinary it is. I think James Comey did a great job of laying out and reminding Americans, look how far we've fallen. Look where we are. We have the President of the United States calling a cooperating witness in an investigation against him and into him and his administration a rat, as though he is a mob boss and not a president. He is maligning all of our institutions, attacking them, and actually weaponizing them to protect himself and his own interests. It's a sad moment.
I think James Comey could have gone farther. There are people who use the word rat to talk about people who cooperate with law enforcement, and it's usually mob bosses. And others have made this point, so he's both attacking the institution of independent law enforcement, and he's using the language of criminals to do it, which really should tell us something.
Right, I think that's very well put. Finally, to you, based on your dealings with the special counsel's office, do you think they're ready for what Trump may do next, including potentially trying to do an end run around the probe or use pardons?
Oh, gosh, I have no idea. I do think I've heard reporting that they're gearing up for a potential subpoena showdown. We heard Rudy say over his dead body that Trump would go in and talk to...
You think Mueller will still subpoena for actual live testimony?
I think if he felt like he needed it, he would absolutely do so. If he felt like the law was on his side, he's sort of a straight-laced guy. He's probably going to follow that Office of Legal Counsel memorandum.
What's one thing you learned about them from dealing directly with them that the rest of us might not know?
Oh, well, they play hardball. I will say that.
Tough. Tough.
They are tough. They are tough.
All right.
That's all I'll say.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. We always like talking to people who are right in the middle of it. And as you know, we've talked to your client's wife, and maybe your client, George, will come on, as he knows he's invited. Maya Wiley, Margay, and Caroline Polisi, thanks to all of you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us. and we appreciate that.